Bob Lazar. We're talking about gray aliens. And according to Lazar, the reactor was a matter-antimatter reactor. One of the largest explosions that we know of is the annihilation of matter and antimatter. CERN, the largest man-made machine on planet Earth, is a Large Hadron Collider. The Chinese are building one 10 times the size of that. I personally believe that Bob Lazar is telling the truth.
What do you think? Are they coming from space and under? I mean, I don't know. I don't know, man. I think I've interviewed a lot of people about this stuff. I've come to the conclusion I think it's all spiritual.
I'm entirely persuaded that that there's an extraterrestrial component to this, and I'll tell you why. You're probably familiar with the testimony of Bob Lazar.
Yeah.
You know, Bob Lazar allegedly worked at the Nevada facility, the S4 facility by Groom Lake, and was involved in the reverse engineering program. He worked on a particular saucer that he denominates the sports model because it was sleek and it was functional. And his job in the program specifically was to work on the reactor. And according to Lazar, the reactor was a matter-antimatter reactor. And in order to function, it required a piece of exotic matter that was machined into a triangle. And that exotic matter is called, was called by Lazar, element 115. And Lazar talked about this back in the early 90s. And element 115, I mean, nobody knew what the heck he was talking about, but today we actually have identified it's called moscavium. And we can synthesize it. The Russians have been able to synthesize it, but we don't have a stable isotope. The only isotopes that we know of on Earth are not stable. But this craft, according to Lazar, the reactor of this saucer that he was working on, it used a stable form of element 115. And this exotic matter was essential to the operation of the craft, to the reactor. And again, it was a matter-antimatter reaction. And of course, one of the largest explosions that we know of is the annihilation of matter and antimatter. Matter and antimatter annihilate each other. We know antimatter is real. We can actually...
What is antimatter?
I'm not a physicist, but antimatter is like the opposite of matter. And matter
so it's nothing.
It's not nothing. I'm not qualified to answer the question, what is antimatter? I know it exists, and I know that we can create antimatter at CERN. We have created antimatter at CERN, but you know, it only exists for fractions of a second. And by the way, you know, antimatter, that collision between matter and antimatter, that annihilation, that could be turned into a weapon. You can weaponize that. You can stabilize it, and that you can build antimatter bombs. Well, you know, I mentioned that CERN, the largest man-made machine on planet Earth, is a Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, in the CERN. And the Chinese are building one 10 times the size of that.
No, I didn't know that.
At least they were. They definitely were. I would assume that the project is still underway. And again, the CERN is the largest man-made machine on Earth. Chinese are building one 10 times larger. The objective of CERN, ostensibly, is they want to find out what happened at the Big Bang. Right? I went to CERN and talked to the physicists there, the particle physicists, and they want to know what happened at the Big Bang. They want to know how the universe came to be and all of that. The idea is to look back in time. But I don't think that's why the Chinese are building a particle.
Probably not.
An atom smasher that's 10 times the size of CERN. I think what they're after is antimatter weapons, an antimatter bomb. I mean, you have antimatter bombs are many times more powerful than you know, thermonuclear bomb warhead, and they don't have that. The problem with nuclear weapons is the fallout. You radiate everything, right? So if you drop a bomb on a city, nuclear bomb, well, you have rendered that city, that area, unusable. You've radiated it. The soil is going to be ruined. Look at Fukushima, right? You created you turn it into Fukushima. So if you're like the Chinese and you're interested in occupying, let's say, the breadbasket of America because you need more food, you don't want to nuke it. Because you destroy the soil, you radiate it, and you render it useless. But an antimatter bomb, that's another situation. You could create an explosion that is bigger, more powerful, more intense than a nuclear explosion without that, without the radiation, without nuking that area, so you could bomb it and then make use of it afterwards. So that's a little rabbit trail there, but I think that's why the Chinese are interested in building a collider, precisely because of the matter-antimatter annihilation. It is exceedingly powerful. So going back to the reactor, this, of course, comes from the testimony of Bob Lazar, that there's a matter-antimatter reaction happening inside of the reactor, and it's generating an enormous amount of energy, the kind of energy that's required to generate and to control gravity waves. And that's how Lazar says that those craft work. They produce gravity waves, and that's all featured in the testimony of Bob Lazar. He wrote a really good book called Dreamland where he describes all of this. I personally believe that Bob Lazar is telling the truth. I am persuaded that his testimony is true, and I know there's a lot of controversy out there about that, but by the way, Lazar's testimony synchronizes with Grush's testimony and with Lou Elizondo's testimony. It perfectly synchronizes. The craft that Lazar worked on, the sports model, the interior of the craft was designed for diminutive people. In other words, for little guys who, according to Lazar, the people who worked at the S4 facility referred to as the kids. We're talking about gray aliens. And I have people who come to me who are, they're whistleblowers, but they're not whistleblowing in an official capacity yet. And some of these guys have been on crash retrieval sites, and they've been involved in various aspects of crash retrievals, the protocols, and they've seen the bodies. And the bodies are little gray guys. So, yes, I'm absolutely persuaded that we are looking at a nuts and bolts physical phenomenon, craft that actually crashes, and corporeal biological beings who die. Again, this is the testimony of David Grush. This is the testimony of Lou Elizondo and others. And there are more, by the way. There are more witnesses coming forward. There's going to be another hearing. And we're going to hear more. I mean, we're going to see more witnesses. And, Tim Burchett, Congressman Burchett, tried to push through legislation, whistleblower protection legislation. I don't know if you knew that.
I did.
I think it was last year. Because what they really need to do is to protect whistleblowers who are coming from the legacy program. Because we have guys like Grush and Elizondo who've come up against the program, who are not read into the program, but have knowledge of it. But what we don't have yet are whistleblowers who had hands on the craft.